Start with contracting sprites. Chapter 11. Its tiny little body was completely light yellow, with faint green patterns on its back. It's a silkworm baby. I've actually met a wild sprite on the outskirts. Silkworm baby snuck out to rest when Su Hao was memorizing his book and was shocked from suddenly seeing a strange human. Its soft body bent slightly, and it disappeared into the bushes in a flash. Gulinjao looked at the shaking bushes and froze for a long while. Reminded Little Spring Sprite. Oh yeah. Little Spring Sprite, let's chase, quickly. A few moments later. What should we do, Little Spring Sprite? We seem to have gotten lost. Gulinjao hugged her backpack, gave the woods on the left a stare, then observed the bushes on the right for a while, and fell into deep thought. Until Little Spring Sprite reached out and pulled at her pants a little, pointing at the way from which they came. Gulinjao turned and looked back, stared for a long while, then tilted her head. You've made marks? That's awesome, Little Spring Sprite. Little Spring Sprite showed a tired but nevertheless polite smile. Gulinjao pulled herself together, and then, she saw the bushes not far away shake, and a sprite even taller than her sprinted out of them. Her look became nervous immediately. Hey? So it's actually a human. The look on the girl's face was clearly that of relief. Su Hao was rendered speechless. Gulinjao finally noticed that beside the feet of the boy of a similar age to her, followed a light yellow sprite. It was the silkworm baby that she followed and got lost chasing just now. She blushed. Gulinjao, why are you so stupid? Luckily, nobody knew about it, right? The change of expression on this girl's face was almost like a face changing in Peking operas. Su Hao had to speak to break the embarrassment. Hello, you must also be a beginner sprite trainer. Oh, yes. I'm called Gulinjao. I'm a student at First High School. You must be the sprite trainer of Silkworm Baby, your Silkworm Baby's speed is so fast. She remembered again the Silkworm Baby leaving her behind in an instant, and her face blushed again. Su Hao was puzzled. Why is this girl's face so red the whole time? Could it be because I'm too handsome? He was just about to say some polite words, when he suddenly saw that Gulinjao had already squatted down and moved her head near Silkworm Baby, staring at it. Gurgle. Silkworm Baby retreated strategically. Your Silkworm Baby is so well cultivated. After all, there was a certified sprite cultivator in her family. Having been imbued with what she saw and heard, although Gulinjao couldn't say exactly how this Silkworm Baby was outstanding, instinct told her that this Silkworm Baby just looked different. It even fled so fast. Su Hao, whose social position was once again inferior to Silkworm Baby, could only touch his hair with embarrassment. His look fell on that water blue sprite. Little Spring Sprite. Its evolution pathway is Spirit Spring Sprite, Tide Calling Spring Sprite. Though it was water element, it was a rare sprite, possibly even rarer than little charcoal tortoises. Su Hao hadn't seen it at Yunhua City's Sprite Free-Ranging Center, for one. Tide Calling Spring Sprite was an elementary sprite. It could learn a unique high-level skill called Elementary Body. It was very strong and powerful, and the upper limit to its potential was extremely high. The ordinary person couldn't obtain it. Su Hao opened the interface. Basic information about the little spring sprite appeared in his eyes. In it, a line of introduction said, a sprite consisted of water, has no feet under the dress, moves in the manner of water streams, sometimes traces of water are left in the places it passes. However, Gulinjao's little spring sprite didn't. Where it passed by, the fallen leaves were only pressed flat, but not wet. This was a manifestation of control powers. Su Hao felt that this was an extraordinary little spring sprite. Gulinjao wanted to poke Silkworm Baby, but she didn't dare to. Little Spring Sprite turned its head around, it was very sad. Su Hao, "Are you also training your sprite here?" she asked. Then, she saw that Silkworm Baby couldn't stand Gulinjao's approaching face and leaped to the branches in a flash. Its agile movement made Gulinjao's eyes brighten when looking at it. "Yes, I'm training Silkworm Baby's agility. I'm also training at Lake East Hill. I was training Little Spring Sprite's ability to compress water stream. When Little Spring Sprite's spiritual force and compressing ability are both enough, it will be able to learn the unique skill Water Arrow." Su Hao was a bit surprised. Is this what rich Sprite Trainer families with heritage are like? In comparison, Lu Ren's everyday show-off of what my little charcoal tortoise ate today was really shallow. It had nothing to do with him being envious, no. Upon thinking about Water Arrow, Su Hao remembered that at the moment, Silkworm Baby's agility training had met a bottleneck. The training of going around trees became less and less effective, but he had no money to go to high-end training facilities. But isn't Little Spring Sprite practicing spraying water streams? Apart from power and compression, aiming was also key. May as well find a tool sprite. Oh no, train together. Su Hao spoke about his thoughts, and Gulinjao agreed without thinking. Okay, that's great. Right, Little Spring Sprite. Little Spring Sprite was displeased. Now you remember me? They came to the edge of the woods, an area near the lake. Here, there was a certain amount of plantation, and it was also near a water body. It was a beneficial environment for both Silkworm Baby and Little Spring Sprite. Su Hao pointed to 3 trees with dense leaves and said seriously to Silkworm Baby, "For the best training effect, you must stay within the range of these 3 trees. Well, on the trees. And dodge water streams. Understood?" Gurgle. Silkworm Baby stared at him intently with its big, watery eyes. No way, don't even think about it." Gurgle. It crawled up on the tree trunk in a dilly-dally manner, feeling hopeless about its life. "I got away from the devastation of the demonic Sprite Trainer and met a fellow Sprite. I should feel double happiness, but how did I end up this way? Hey? Little Spring Sprite, what's that look? I treated you as a friend, but you want to hit me?" The 2 sprites looked at each other, and a dense atmosphere spread. Both Su Hao and Gulinjao felt slightly nervous. Gurgle. The 2 sprites called out fiercely, and the dense atmosphere was immediately gone. Little Spring Sprite called a few times and gathered water streams. Its mouth pouted slightly, and like a high-pressure water gun, it sprayed out a pure white water stream. Gurgle. The water stream came too fast, and too unexpectedly. The little guy was so scared that its body rolled up and its eyes closed. Su Hao! What a disgrace, get off the battlefield! But before he could speak, Su Hao saw that the water stream was sprayed onto another branch an arm's length away from Silkworm Baby, bringing the branch to shake intensely, with only a few drops of water landing on Silkworm Baby's body. It shook a little. Su Hao made a dry cough. Silkworm Baby half opened an eye cautiously. Gulinjao's face blushed. Little Spring Sprite. Little Spring Sprite, which was still spraying out the water stream, froze. So it's off target, They rested, lectured, for 10 minutes before the 2 sprites fixed their eyes on each other once again. Little Spring Sprite forewent part of the power to also pay attention to the aim. A stream of water sprayed toward Silkworm Baby on the tree. This time, though Silkworm Baby was still a bit flustered, its short little legs exerted force and ran away rapidly, traveling through the branches like it was flat ground. A stream of water flew past behind it. Silkworm Baby made a satisfied call. Little Spring Sprite was annoyed. It no longer accumulated water but spewed out thin lines of water from its mouth. It had almost no power, but the speed was not slow at all, scaring Silkworm Baby to instinctively leap up, somersaulting in the air before dropping down on another tree. Its 8 short legs held onto the tree branches very steadily. Gurgle. It didn't expect itself to be so agile and made 2 more provoking calls. Beside the water, little spring Sprite's speed of spraying water stream became faster and faster. On the tree branches, Silkworm Baby dodged with more and more smoothness and agility. It didn't forget to call out provokingly. Little spring Sprite was so angry that its face inflated, though it was somewhat inflated, to begin with. Little spring Sprite was a type of sprite that had a much greater amount of spiritual force from birth than Silkworm Babies, and it made use of the water source, the lake. The consumption of spraying water streams was also not that great. Nevertheless, it couldn't stand spraying dozens of water streams like a water gun. Most importantly, it didn't hit. Little spring Sprite was angry and tired. While restraining its anger, it kept on spraying water streams, until the spiritual force in its body was used up, and it was also exhausted. Its little body made a few dizzy sways and fell down, splashing up water droplets. Little spring Sprite lost its battle power. Silkworm Baby won the training contest. Gurgle. Silkworm Baby roared loudly, swaying about on the branch. As the victor, the Sprite Trainer of Silkworm Baby got a great deal of attention. Gulinjao clearly didn't anticipate that her little spring Sprite's water stream spraying, after more than 10 days of training, couldn't hit the target even once. Indeed, it still needs to continue practicing more. Did you hear it? You have to continue practicing. Su Hao poked Silkworm Baby's soft body and shared more cultivation tips with Gulinjao. For example, so long as the training didn't kill them, they should keep training. Sprites were much better at withstanding pressure than humans. Silkworm Baby, which was just immersed in the joy of victory, rolled its eyes. PSST, Sprite Trainers. Chapter 12. In the twinkling of an eye, it was the first day of school for 3rd grade high schoolers. Well, the first day of school for the Sprite stream. Ordinary arts and science stream students had long been buried in the sea of exam questions. Sprite Stream Campus, Class 2. Su Hao's high school was the best high school in an city. More than 90% of students made it into undergraduate studies in every batch, and almost half went to top universities. But those were all before the world changed. Today, Su Hao arrived at a strange campus, right next to the ordinary campus, with a larger land area. But there were only 3rd graders here, and only less than 200 students. It was no wonder that tuition and miscellaneous fees for the Sprite stream was more than 50,000 yuan per year. This was already after subsidies from the government and the Union of Sprite Trainers. For the sake of the campus, I will bear with it. From far away, Su Hao saw the big, round face of Lu Ren. He waved, and roared with his loud voice, "Su Hao, you're also 2-1. Su Hao was so embarrassed, he walked by rapidly, pretending that he didn't know him. "Hey, wait, slow down, I meant that you are in class 2. I'm also in class 2. How did you know?" Su Hao wasn't Lu Ren, who filled his social media with all kinds of information about himself every day. "Haha, it's internal information. This is your Silkworm Baby, right? It's so good looking, indeed. Cuter than my tortoise." Little charcoal tortoise, passing by Lu Ren's foot, abruptly spewed out several fire sparks, marking his pants legs with dots of burnt black. Lu Ren's eyes widened, and he was angry. *T, Master Tortoise, I'm sorry. Upon seeing the black smoke that came out of little charcoal tortoise's mouth and nose, Lu Ren immediately followed his heart. Little charcoal tortoise left Lu Ren behind and walked forward casually, its steps looking like that of an old gentleman taking a walk in the park. The fat and heavy Silkworm Baby rested on top of Su Hao's head, like a light yellow hat. It was enthusiastically greeting every sprite that it saw. Gurgle. Gurgle, gurgle. Little peas, fluffy balls, grassland wolves, patterned alligators, little rolling stones, mini pigs, and so on. All of them were common and cheap sprites. Su Hao had done a comprehensive study of Sprite knowledge, with one look, he could name every sprite he saw. Lu Ren's attention was completely on the beginner sprite trainers. That guy is from class 3, that one's from class 4. Oh, that's Linzian from class 1, the genius whose soul strength was 1.8 at the exam previously. There are 4 sprite classes. Yet, one more than the last batch. I don't know if Sprite universities expanded their enrollment this year. If they didn't, the difficulty of getting into Sprite universities would be much harder. You are still worried you won't get into one? I have to. My dad said, if after spending so much money I still can't get into a good Sprite university, he'll break my legs. How can I not find it difficult? Lu Ren was extremely grievous. However, he was only grievous for 1 second. In a moment, he started speaking again, mysteriously. Do you know where that freak with a 2.1 soul strength from class 5 back then went? Where did he go? Can it be that he's not in our school? Su Hao didn't yet understand on that day. Afterward, he gained more knowledge. It was indeed rare for a high school 3rd grader to have a soul strength beyond 2.0. Perhaps Theron City produced only this single one this year. He got invited to transfer to Yunhua University affiliated high school. I heard the students there can go to Yunhua Sprite University through direct admissions in the future. There were 2 types of Sprite universities. One type was comprehensive universities with a Sprite school. The other type was specialized Sprite universities, usually named XX Sprite University, or directly named after a specific type of Sprite. Flamingo University, for example, was one of the top Sprite universities. Although Dragon Capital University was a comprehensive university, the campus for its Sprite school was larger than even its main campus, with a strong faculty. It had little difference from specialized Sprite universities. No matter which type of university, the number of students enrolled every year was really few, and there were also very few schools. The whole Tianese province had only 5 universities with Sprite-related majors. Yunhua Sprite University was one of the best, which was evident through the direct admission scheme. Even Lu Ren's words smelled of jealousy. Su Hao had only transmigrated for about a dozen days, and he had no clear sense of it. Is a soul strength above 2.0 really that outstanding? Besides, when one cultivates 2 sprites at the same time, can he attend to one without neglecting the other? Lu Ren explained sourly, Yunhua University affiliated high school will definitely help him plan. Even his initial sprites are gifted by the school. I heard it was a little stone elephant and a glowing firefly. The battle power from having 2 sprites is not simply 1 + 1 = 2. Besides, after the feedback benefits, his speed of growth of soul power is twice that of ours. You've got to know that apart from contracting sprites, soul power can also be used to assist sprites in battles. He looked up at the blue sky and the white clouds and sighed pretentiously. Sigh, high spending is no match for good natural qualities. Get lost. Poverty made Su Hao mean. As they spoke, they had reached the classroom building. There was only one classroom building at the Sprite Stream campus. Apart from it, there were buildings for equipment rooms, battle halls, etc. All the buildings together occupy only a small part of the campus, and most of it was built into different types of outdoor training environments, such as woods, water bodies, abandoned metal factory areas, rugged rocky areas. Ordinary students may not understand it, but Su Hao knew that during Sprite training, being in an environment of the same attribute during Sprite training could bring some subtle benefits. Well, but there were no environments suitable for fire element sprites, probably due to the cost. Also, few students owned fire element sprites on campus. Those who could manage to get fire element or even rarer elemental sprites, they probably would never worry about training environments. All these could be settled by throwing in money. Su Hao was not envious at all. Humph. 3rd grade. The classroom of Class 2 of Sprite Stream was very spacious, with vacant spaces on all 4 sides of each seat. Those were spaces reserved for sprites. Sprites also needed to take classes. For many training methods, it was better to just let students and sprites listen to classes together instead of teaching the methods to students and then making the students teach their sprites. The intelligence level of the sprites entering adulthood was comparable to that of an 11 or 12-year-old child. Su Hao spent much time walking about the campus. Currently, there were already quite a lot of people in the classroom. All of their chats were about topics related to sprites. The appearance of the two immediately attracted attention. The looks of most of the boys focused on Lu Ren's sprite. Su Hao glanced around and found that Lu Ren's little charcoal tortoise was still the only fire element sprite in the class. As for the girls, many of them stared at Silkworm Baby on top of Su Hao's head with sparkling eyes. It was so cute that the girls' liking for him increased exponentially. If Su Hao took the initiative, it would be far too easy for him to get the contacts of several of them. Nevertheless, he wasn't interested. Was it not fun to play with the sprite? Were novels not interesting? Girls were the root of problems that got in his way. Soon, the bell rang, and the form teacher walked into the classroom, holding a name list. It was a female teacher, not the easy type. Her serious face and aura made the classroom quieten down instantly. Many excited classmates suddenly felt that the atmosphere wasn't right, touched their heads, and obediently returned to their seats. The form teacher knocked on the blackboard and wrote the words Chen Fangjia on it. "I'm your form teacher of the year, my surname is Chen. I'm in charge of your coming studies and training. In the first and second years, you've already finished the academic subjects you're supposed to learn. In the following year, the main classes are sprite cultivation, training and commanding sprite battles, etc. It also includes physical training for yourselves." Her right hand pressed on the surface on the teacher's table, and her cold gaze swept over. Some students may think that with feedback benefits from the sprite, there's no more need to exercise. Some may even think that battle is for sprites. Those are huge mistakes. Sprite trainers are never commanders hidden behind the scenes, sprite trainers are comrades in sprite battles. A sprite trainer lacking in training would only drag the feet of their own sprite in fights. Don't think that it's an easy thing to become a sprite trainer. She paused for a moment, and then said in a slightly milder tone, "You can't fall behind on ordinary academic subjects as well. Remember to do more exam papers and practice questions. In the college entrance examination, apart from sprite exam questions and fighting assessment, the weightage of academic subjects is also significant. Don't lose your chance to enter sprite universities because of the marks you lost for academic subjects." After a series of words, the third-grade students, who were just in the excitement after contracting sprites, felt like they had cold water poured all over them. Even their heads bowed down. They somehow felt that the days at Sprite Stream would be different from what they imagined. Miss Chen took the attendance and made the students do a self-introduction. They got to know one another at the most basic level. That's all for the class meeting. Next. Well, scan this QR code, and join the class group, change your group nickname to name Sprite format. She picked up a remote control and pressed it, and the projector projected the pattern of a QR code. Su Hao didn't expect this at all. The class group in second grade. Why does it also seem to be created by the form teacher? I didn't say anything wrong, right? Chapter 13. After the class meeting was the collection of textbooks. By the end of all the procedures, it was already noon. It was now time for lunch and an afternoon nap. When it reached afternoon, the school bell rang. All the students were instructed to assemble at the sports field, together with their sprites. The students formed a gym class formation with some difficulty, while their sprites capered and frolicked about noisily. Su Hao picked up his silkworm baby and placed it on top of his head. The little fellow looked rather miserable but gave in to Su Hao's imposing might nevertheless. Fatty Ren and Su Hao were in the same class. Su Hao looked at the other classes and quickly found Chen Qi, Zhou Yuz, and Ma Ruo something. He spied a familiar figure in the row of Class 1 students. That's Gulinjao, the genius with the highest chance of enrolling in a prestigious Sprite-related school in our batch. Su Hao sensed dialogue coming from the side. After turning around, he realized that Chatterbox Lu had popped up again at some point. However, how did you know that? This is known as gathering intel about your competitors in advance. It's only when you know your competitors and yourself inside out that you can. What was it again? Lu Ren cleared his throat and added, Gulinjao was already a star student during Year 1 and Year 2, and she has never dropped out of the top 3 positions of the level. But that's not the main point. He changed the topic and said, Gulinjao's uncle is a mid-level sprite cultivator, and her father is even an honorary member of the Association of Sprite Trainers of An City. Get it? Su Hao understood. This was an even higher class existence than a WHALE1. Completely crushed and defeated, Lu Ren's rationality was all gone. Lu Ren. During their conversation, old Chen, their form teacher, walked over to them. Her sharp gaze swept across everyone. Several students who were whispering to each other straightened their backs at once, finding old Chen even more fearsome than the headmaster. Today is the first day of school. Therefore, the school has decided to give you all an evaluation test. All the students were confused. Was there any clear correlation between the start of school and an evaluation test? Excuse me, the Sprite training hadn't even started. The facial expressions of students who hadn't heard the news beforehand changed. Their mouths hung slightly ajar. However, intimidated by old Chen's aura, they ultimately didn't dare to raise any questions. Old Chen added, it's a very simple test. Run 10 rounds about the field with your sprite. 10 rounds, 4 kilometers. It was doable for people who worked out regularly, but many high school students lacked exercise in the first place. Even if their goal was to become a sprite trainer, shouldn't they be commanding their sprites to battle instead? Why was this happening? The sprite stream was supposed to be a happy one. Su Hao opened and closed his mouth before he looked at Lu Ren. Both of them looked miserable. Lu Ren's condition didn't need further explanation. The standard of his physical condition was obvious from his little belly. Su Hao himself had never run 10 rounds before in the past. The most he had ever done was 6 to 7 rounds. The female students moaned and groaned. They actually had to run the same distance as the boys. Old Chen's response was that sprite trainers didn't differentiate between males and females. Neither did they differentiate between the strong and muscular and the small and feeble. For a moment, it was as if dark grey clouds had enveloped the land. There was only pure darkness before them. It has really turned dark? Oh, it's Silkworm Baby's short little legs that are blocking my vision. Old Chen continued to speak. The school will reward the top 10 students of this evaluation test with a month's worth of Sprite Jade powder. The top 3 will receive 3 months' worth. Su Hao straightened his back all at once. In his mind, he did the math with the 6th grade mental calculation skills he had learned before. If a month's worth of jade powder cost 2,250 yuan, how much did 3 months' worth come up to again? Well, in any case, it's a lot. Even if all the students in the 4 Sprite Stream classes were to be added up, there were only a total of 100-odd students. Top 10? Su Hao felt that it was worth a try. What if he succeeded? The rewards in no time attracted most students from regular families. Only whales like Tycoon Lu didn't care for it. As they were raring to go, their eyes gave off light as they rubbed their palms together in anticipation. All the students from the 4 Sprite Stream classes went over to the running track. Under the cajoling of their trainers, the sprites sat by their sides with much difficulty. As there were quite a lot of people, the students were separated into several rows. White lines were drawn with chalk on the running track. Su Hao was in the center. Next to him was Lu Fatty Ren. Silkworm Baby and Little Charcoal Tortoise followed their owners and stayed at their feet. Su Hao lowered his head slightly and saw a large number of sprites that had only just entered their growth stage. They weren't any larger than his silkworm baby. It was a little crowded. Su Hao was afraid that he would step on a sprite accidentally. That would be awful. But then, he thought of how nimble silkworm baby was when jumping about in the trees. He probably wouldn't be able to step on the sprites since they were this nimble, right? The form teacher of Class 1, a balding teacher whom he didn't know the name of, picked up a whistle and suddenly blew it loudly. The students in the very first row dashed out with great vigor. However, "Little ground wolf, where are you going? Mini pig, where are you? Salted fish king, move! Hurry and move!" The commotion created by the loud and clear whistle and students abruptly dashing out caused a furor among the group of young baby sprites. Those that were slightly bolder dashed about happily on the running track, while the slightly more timid ones clung onto their trainer's legs, trembling as they did so. There were even sprites that ran onto the field and started chewing the grass. Su Hao cast a glance at one of them. It was a grass sheep. Nothing wrong with its actions, it seemed. The 10-round marathon could be said to be a large-scale car crash scene. It was already a huge mess before it had even begun. The group of newbie sprite trainers was at a loss as to what to do. They didn't know whether to continue running or to chase after their sprites first. Should they chase after the sprites, would they be able to catch up to them? And if they did, they didn't know whether they could get the sprites to listen to their commands and run with them either. The form teachers of the few classes stood at a distance and observed them with detachment. This batch of students is terrible. How are they supposed to become sprite trainers if they can't even keep their own sprites in control, said the male teacher of Class 3. The female teacher of Class 4 rebutted him. You speak as if the previous batch was any much better. Don't forget that you were thrown into a tizzy all the time back when you had just contracted your first sprite. Cough, cough, cough. The male teacher chuckled in embarrassment. There are a few with pretty good potential nevertheless, said the form teacher of Class 1 as he looked towards the sports field. At this point, after the initial chaos, there were already some students who were running ahead with their sprites. Gradually, they formed a few distinct tiers. The third tier was made up of students who managed to barely assuage their sprites but needed to shout as they ran. The moment they took their eye off their sprites, they would run off right away. The second tier consisted of students whose sprites were more obedient. However, their sprites couldn't keep up with their speed, leading to the students having to slow down their pace. The first tier comprised students who moved at a speed that was close to their usual running speed. As expected, Gulin Jo from your class is an important seedling. Her sprite is nurtured pretty well, said old Chen of Class 2. That's to be expected. It's a few other good seedlings that are giving me a pleasant surprise, however. They are much more outstanding than the previous batch of students. The last name of Class 1's form teacher was Gu. Compared to the other three, he had an obvious characteristic: he was old. He was already a middle-aged man and had a sparse amount of hair. However, even without cradling a thermos cup in his hands, he was in good spirits. He was the teacher with the longest record of service in the sprite stream. Mr. Old Gu looked toward the field and said, Kung Fu Pup, Silkworm Baby, Vine Snake. What are the names of their sprite trainers? Wait. He suddenly frowned. What's going on with the mini pig's sprite trainer? A male student in the first tier was carrying a mini pig in his arms. He was running rather fast. He was big and tall and looked like someone who frequently worked out. The mini pig was small in size as well, so carrying it in his arms didn't affect his running speed much. He gradually got nearer to the first few students in front. However, the teachers were frowning. The young form teacher of Class 4 said, He seems like a student from my class. Humph, what an embarrassment. I'm going to record his name in my little notebook later. The purpose of this evaluation test is to put the intimacy level between a sprite trainer and their sprite, as well as their ability to command their sprite, to the test in the first place. You've got to hand it to him to be able to think of something like running while forcibly carrying his sprite. Can't he see that even the mini pig is feeling unwell? Chapter 14. On the running track, Su Hao and Silkworm Baby gradually squeezed their way out of the chaotic area where the starting line was. Suddenly, it was as if even the air had become much fresher. Su Hao looked back and noticed that the running track was still in a state of chaos. Several playful and mischievous sprites had scampered off the running track and were dashing about joyfully. Newbie sprite trainers chased after them with looks of anxiety while shouting constantly. The sprites ran about even more happily. Thanks to this, the running track, which was originally rather packed, had become a lot more spacious. As for the few classmates whom Su Hao was familiar with, Chen Qi and his little stone elephant were running in front of him to the side, while Zhou Yu's was in a panic because his bubbling squid was nowhere in sight. Ma something Mei was running ahead with her green bamboo leaf, but it was drifting about in an S shape. As for Lu Ren, his little charcoal tortoise didn't run about, nor did it move in an S-shaped or Z-shaped path. It was just that. It was a little slow. Just like elderly men strolling in the park, it was walking at a very leisurely pace. Big Fatty Lu paced up and down next to it, calling out Master Tortoise over and over to it, and trying to convince it to speed up. However, the great Master Tortoise simply wouldn't spare him even a glance. It continued to walk forward, step by step, at its own pace. In the blink of an eye, Big Face Lu had already fallen behind to the third tier. Su Hao gave him a helpless look. Then, he began to adjust the rhythm of his breathing and increased his speed with Silkworm Baby. Before long, he had already overtaken the big and tall Chen Qi. Oh, don't be mistaken. It wasn't because Su Hao's athletic abilities were more outstanding than Chen Qi. It was purely because Chen Qi little stone elephant ran a little slower. No, it really was rather slow. It ran at about the same speed as a human jogger. However, Su Hao could tell that little stone elephant was already trying its best. He looked at the other classmates, or rather, their sprites. The sprites in the first tier were very obedient in following their sprite trainer's commands. They didn't create any trouble. However, their tiny bodies and clumsy running stances continuously made the corner of Su Hao's mouth twitch uncontrollably. There were even sprites which tripped once every 3 steps and had to flip back upright before continuing to run. Doubts filled Su Hao's mind. During these recent few days after the other students had contracted their sprites, were they only feeding the sprites and nothing more? Did they not bring them out for a walk even once? Gurgle, gle. Silkworm Baby stood upright proudly and called out at him. Su Hao wanted to dampen its enthusiasm, but unfortunately, he couldn't think of anything. It was just a weak little Silkworm Baby. Yet why was it that next to the budding new sprites of the new batch of sprite trainers, it seemed just that tad bit more outstanding? There must be something wrong somewhere. Su Hao lowered his head and continued to run. He had already overtaken quite a few students. In the blink of an eye, there were only 5 students in the first tier that he was in, including himself. What a surprise, he was actually this powerful now. Silkworm Baby was unimpressed. There was someone whom he knew in the first tier, Gulinjao. Her ponytail swung left and right as she ran. Little Spring Sprite moved forward while pushing its long dress hem. Even the color of its water flow had darkened. This was an indication that sprites such as the Little Spring Sprite were performing at full capacity. Gurgle. Silkworm Baby, which was overtaking it at the side, used mock. Little Spring Sprite paused momentarily, but didn't pay it any heed. It continued to move forward. Gurgle. Silkworm Baby continued mocking it. Little Spring Sprite ignored it again, just that its tiny little face had already turned a deep blue from keeping its temper in check. Gurgle, gurgle. Silkworm Baby used mock thrice in succession. Little Spring Sprite couldn't keep it in anymore. Hum. Hum. Splat. Little Spring Sprite lost its balance and fell flat on its face, just like a pool of liquid that got flattened, before it slowly pulled back up. Silk worm baby. You'd better behave yourself. Su Hao's large hand came descending from above, but Silkworm Baby dodged it nimbly. Su Hao blushed in embarrassment. He could only let out a dry cough and use his skill, the imposing might of a Sprite Trainer. Stare. Silkworm Baby turned away. Sprite Trainers. Su Hao gradually got into things. After he had adjusted his breathing, he didn't feel anything out of the ordinary with his body after running one round. The first tier had already taken form. There were only 6 students there. The 6th student was someone he knew, Chen Qi. In 5th place was Gulinjiao, the only girl in the first tier. It was just that Little Spring Sprite was slower than Little Stone Elephant. Thus, it looked like it was going to be overtaken. Su Hao was in 3rd place. He didn't expect that someone whose athletic abilities had always been mediocre would actually rank in the top few positions in this level-wide evaluation test. This wasn't even a quick sprint that depleted all his stamina. It was as if there was a continuous stream of energy being produced in his body. He felt like he could run another 100 rounds. Yeah, right, of course not. However, he did have an entirely possible chance at fighting for the rewards of the top 3 positions. As expected, I've already become powerful before I knew it. Silkworm Baby cast a glance at its Sprite Trainer. It grunted and continued to slack discreetly. Slacking discreetly was the only thing it could do now. The starting point of the running track was no longer packed by this point. Through the use of various methods, the newbie Sprite Trainers had finally managed to regain control over their sprites and bring them over to the running track. However, there were also a few who couldn't. Salted Fish King flipped over and continued to sleep. Grass Sheep had already chewed a patch of grass bald. It was unknown whether the trainer would need to provide compensation for it. Although Su Hao's imagination was running wild, his speed wasn't slow at all. Instead, it was even gradually increasing slightly. When his graceful form ran past Lu Ren, he waved at him, completing yet another round. Lu Ren. He looked at Silkworm Baby, which could keep up with Su Hao's running speed with no problem whatsoever. Silkworm Baby. Then, he looked at his little charcoal tortoise, which was so slow that it was no different from an old man strolling in the park. He couldn't help but get mad. If you don't speed up, I'm going to cut off its food supply. If little charcoal tortoise didn't grow, the one who would lose out in the end seemed to be himself. As for other things, Master Tortoise was not interested at all. Big Face Lu raised his head to the sky. Looking up at the blue skies and white clouds, he contemplated whether it was time for him to spend some money and buy some treasures that could increase a sprite's speed. In the twinkling of an eye, Su Hao had already completed 3 rounds. By steadily increasing his speed, he had already successfully risen to 2nd place and pulled ahead of the student in 3rd place by dozens of meters. He took a look at the student in 1st place, who was less than 20 meters away from him. It was a boy with a crew cut. His rhythm was as steady as Su Hao's. His sprite was a kung fu pup, an earth element sprite which looked like a little puppy standing upright. However, from what Su Hao recalled, this was a relatively uncommon species. Kung fu pup's pace was also very rhythmic. Su Hao adjusted his condition and gave Silkworm Baby a discreet look. It was time to speed up. The distance between the two of them closed up swiftly. At this point, the boy with the crew cut looked behind him. When he realized that someone was catching up to him, excitement seemed to flash across his eyes. He gave Su Hao a thumbs up. And then, whoosh! He raced off into the distance. Su Hao chased after him for 10 seconds. The distance between them continued to pull apart. After chasing after him for 20 seconds at an increased pace, Su Hao was breathing rather hard. He felt rather beaten. Let's just stay in 2nd place. The reward for the top 3 is the same anyway. What's the point in putting in so much effort to fight for an empty title? All of these are just empty titles. Silkworm Baby gurgled and lowered its head as it sped up further. A competitive spirit known as mutual appreciation for its rival started burning in its large eyes. But all of a sudden, it felt like something seemed to be missing next to it. Where was the Sprite Trainer? Where did that big of a person go? Chapter 15. At the finishing point. After 10 rounds, as expected, Su Hao finished in third place. There was simply a limit to his stamina. At the very last moment, he was overtaken by a tall and muscular boy. Old Gu, the form teacher of Class 1, walked over. He looked at the tall and muscular boy and asked, "Where's your sprite?" The boy's gaze shifted to the back. It was only after searching for a while that he found his little rolling stone dozens of meters away in the distance. It was currently rolling along feebly. It's over there." He didn't sound very confident. "Are you aware of the test's requirement? You're supposed to finish 10 rounds with your sprite." I'm just coming to the finishing point in advance to wait for it. Besides, surely other people's sprites aren't next to them at every moment, right?" The more he spoke, the more he was filled with righteous indignation. On the running track, instances of sprites running off the running track were commonplace. His little rolling stone was just lagging behind by a few dozen meters. What was wrong with that? Old Gu cast a glance at him. There was disappointment in his eyes. "Did you think that we wouldn't realize that little rolling stone is falling short by 1 round?" The boy wanted very much to be stubborn and say that that wasn't true. However, when he met Old Gu's eyes straight on, it was as though everything was revealed in his eyes. The stubborn words were stuck in his throat. Instinctively, he lowered his head. "Remember this: there are no sprite trainers who abandon their sprites. Your evaluation test result is disqualified." Little Rolling Stone was a pretty strong sprite. If it had finished its 10 rounds normally, it would still have had a chance at fighting for the top 10 positions. The boy's mouth opened and closed. Then, he walked to the side dejectedly. Old Gu turned to Su Hao. A smile actually appeared on his stern face. "Lad, you're doing pretty well. Continue to work hard." Su Hao responded joyfully. As expected, handsome boys were popular everywhere. As for those who were both handsome and capable, he mustn't be full of himself. He must remain calm. The boy with the crew cut, who had finished all 10 rounds while consistently being in top place and still had energy to spare, suddenly walked toward Su Hao and grinned at him. Su Hao seemed to see teeth with light reflecting off them. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Li Songting. When you've overcome your shortcoming in your physical endurance, I hope we can compete against each other again." All right. I'm Su Hao from Class 2. Su Hao touched the tip of his nose. A challenge invitation was all right, but could he be less blunt about it? What did he mean by a shortcoming in physical endurance? He was clearly making a strategic energy-saving move. How can a strategic move be called a shortcoming? Su Hao grumbled to himself. Silkworm Baby clung onto the hem of his trousers, climbed up to the top of his head, and laid there with its eyes closed. It looked like a large yellow hat on Su Hao's head. Also, it was rather heavy. Su Hao, who had only just taken a few dozen breaths after running 10 rounds around the field, wanted to tug it down. He didn't manage to nudge it. "Gurgle, gurgle!" Silkworm Baby cried out in dissatisfaction. How could one call a sprite lazy? It was clearly resting and conserving its energy. Su Hao found a tree and sat under it. The most pleasurable thing in life was nothing more than being able to hide in the shade and rest while others were still slaving away to finish their 10 rounds. This feels awesome. Right from the start, 10 rounds around the field were already a distance that most students couldn't hope to complete, not to mention when there was even a group of mischievous sprites holding them back. They hadn't even covered half the journey when many of them turned from a jogging state into one where they ran half the time and walked the other half. What were they to do when the teachers had already stated that they had to finish all 10 rounds even if they had to walk? Even students who pretended to have finished all 10 rounds were dragged out by their form teachers. They were completely clear about how many rounds the students needed to complete. The remaining students felt incredibly hopeless. There were obviously more than 100 people on the running track. How was it that they could see everything so clearly? An hour later, Lu Ren finally ran past the finishing point. He crumpled onto the ground and laid there facing up, his little belly shaking up and down in waves. Next to him, little charcoal tortoise spat out a few fiery sparks. It didn't look tired at all. Su Hao had seen the process of Lu Ren's 10 rounds. In the very beginning, Lu Ren had been urging little charcoal tortoise to go faster. By the middle, Lu Ren had been jogging alongside little charcoal tortoise. However, during the second to third last rounds, even if it was a brisk walk, Fatty Lu was already close to being unable to move. He had to grit his teeth in order to keep up with little charcoal tortoise's speed. Was this the legendary race between the tortoise and Lu Ren 1? Lu Ren wasn't part of the tier that arrived last at the finishing point. He barely managed to place in the mid-ranks. He was ahead of the student in the last place by a good 2 rounds. However, in terms of grades, the student in the last place still outdid 1/3 of the student body in the Sprite stream. Even if those people were requested to finish the entire distance, they honestly wouldn't have been able to do it. What were they supposed to do when they couldn't get their sprites to move at all? The newbie sprite trainers felt very hopeless too, you know. Some of them were still cajoling their sprites while the others had already straight up given up on themselves. The whistle rang out at this point. Students of Class 2, assemble. Old Chen's clear and resounding voice reached them from afar. Several people, with their heads hung low, slowly walked over to the assembly point. Old Chen looked at them, her gaze sweeping across every single student's face. She said, "I'm very disappointed in all of you. You are the worst batch of students I've ever taught. Look at all of you. Can sprite trainers still call themselves sprite trainers when they can't even command their sprite to move? Don't give me the excuse that you've only just contracted your sprites. Isn't a new contract a contract all the same? If you can't do it because it's impossible, how can others achieve it then? Commanding sprites is the most basic requirement of a sprite trainer." Old Chen reprimanded them harshly. 1/3 of the students in the rectangular formation hung their heads in shame. Then, Old Chen suddenly changed the targets of her words, just that this time, her tone became a little more mellow. She said, "For those who managed to complete all 10 rounds, all of you are to think about this: just how many of you couldn't keep up with your sprite's speed and ended up holding them back." Lu Ren wasn't the only one. In actuality, while the agility of most sprites which had just entered the growth stage couldn't keep up with a high school student's dash, their stamina outclassed them by miles. Before the students that had initially found their sprites too slow even ran a few rounds, the drastic decline in their own stamina had made them realize that they themselves were too lacking in stamina. The only thing they could do was to get their sprites to slow down. Sprite trainers aren't just a flashy occupation where you get to command sprites to battle on the competition floor. It is an occupation where the human battles alongside his sprite. Old Chen's tone of voice was very serious. With her hands resting on her hips and a sharp look in her eyes, she added, "Things like lack of stamina, insufficient speed, and an untimely response, all of these will become your shortcomings, which will, in turn, become a fatal flaw in your battles. Of course, these things that I'm talking about are still very far in the future for all of you. But all of you must remember this: do not neglect your own training. Sprite trainers and their sprites have never been individual existences that are separate from each other. This time, there are also a few students in our class who performed pretty well. Li Songting, Su Hao, and Qi Lin took first, second, and 8th place, respectively. I hope all of you can follow the examples of these 3 students in the future. I also hope that all of you will continue to work hard and grow to become qualified sprite trainers soon." While hiding the mirth in her eyes, Old Chen merely said dispassionately, "All right, the three of you, follow me." In the office, Old Gu, the form teacher of Class 1 and also the headmaster. Headmaster Gu was currently preparing the rewards for the test. What the school will reward wood element sprites with this time is sap spreading jade powder. Earth element sprites will receive black rock jade powder, while water element ones will. If none of you have any objections, you'll be able to receive the jade powder tomorrow. Today. Old Gu shook his head. He said, the school also needs to procure jade powder which corresponds to your respective sprites. This was very practical. A month's worth of jade powder cost 2,000 odd yuan, and 3 months' worth cost 6,000 odd yuan. This was free money, after all. Even Gulinjao was smiling at this point, despite being in existence that was a class higher than even the whales. Su Hao didn't leave immediately. He waited until the other students had more or less left before he asked hesitantly, Sir, can I change my sap spreading jade powder reward to green bamboo jade powder instead? Why is that? Sap spreading jade powder cost 650 yuan per box while the green bamboo jade powder cost 599 yuan per box. No matter how one looked at it, this wasn't a good deal. Because my sprite is used to eating green bamboo jade powder. Su Hao gave Silkworm Baby a look. Gurgle. Silkworm Baby echoed him unwillingly. Sure, no problem. There would only be an issue if you wanted to change it to a more expensive type, replied Old Gu with a laugh. His words made Su Hao swallow the inquiry of whether he could exchange the difference in value for cash back down his throat. After Su Hao left, Old Gu touched his balding scalp and remarked, looks like this is a student with his own views.